Robert Oppenheimer was born on April 22, 1904 in a wealthy Jewish family in the city of York, USA. Born in Germany, his father Julius left Germany for the United States at a young age. Although he came to America with no assets, he was a prominent and wealthy textile manufacturer in Manhattan when Robert Oppenheimer was born. He married Ella Friedman, a woman of Jewish heritage. She is an artist. Robert Oppenheimer's aesthetic inclination must have been a gift from his mother. His younger brother joins the family when Robert is 8 years old. Robert grew up in a large apartment in one of the most affluent parts of New York City. He studied in the best schools of New York. But during his childhood, he spent a lonely life away from his peers. Because of these different characteristics in him, little Oppenheimer was often teased by other children. When he was 5 years old, he became interested in mineralogy. It is an inherited hobby. A brilliant student, Robert Alcuin completed his schooling with honors in 1.5 years less than the average period of schooling. Robert Oppenheimer enters Harvard University at the age of 18. He originally intended to study chemistry but later switched to physics. But his interest in chemistry remained the same. Here, Oppenheimer studied a wide range of subjects and studied history, Greek and Latin in depth. He spent most of his time in the library. He will complete his 4-year degree at Harvard in 3 years. Then he joins Cambridge University in England for further education. There, the teachings of Lord Ernest Rutherford, who is considered the father of nuclear physics, greatly influenced Robert. Rutherford was the first to discover and describe the nuclear half-life and the radiation involved. In 1908, Rutherford was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for it. In the spring of 1927, Oppenheimer completed his doctorate in physics. During his time at Harvard, Cambridge and Göttingen universities, Oppenheimer had the opportunity to study with a number of contemporaries who would become giants in the study of theoretical physics in the 20th century. During this period, Oppenheimer developed a special interest in Eastern philosophy and mysticism, Hinduism and Confucianism. This interest goes as far as learning Sanskrit. He is always a curious person. However, by this time, Oppenheimer's behavior had become problematic. In 1926, while at Cambridge, an apple was mixed with some poisonous chemicals and placed on the desk of a tutor with whom he had a conflict. His close friend Francis Ferguson claimed that he once attacked him and tried to strangle him when he told him he was engaged. Due to these different behaviors, Oppenheimer lived a lonely life, separated from his peers since childhood. He was a constant extrovert and was said to suffer from frequent bouts of depression. In short, Oppenheimer was an enigma. After completing his studies in Göttingen, Oppenheimer worked for 13 years as a professor of physics at the University of California from 1929. Oppenheimer's teaching methods became very popular in the physics community in the United States. Many of the greatest physicists of later times were trained under him. Oppenheimer, a heavy smoker, bought a farm in New Mexico in search of dry air after developing tuberculosis in the late 1930s. By this time, he had started a romantic relationship with Jean Tatlock, a psychiatry student who was 10 years older than him. Jean is a troubled young woman suffering from severe depression and a conflicted sexuality. Oppenheimer was married to Kitty Harrison, a botanist and physicist, when she committed suicide in January 1944. By that time, Robert and Kitty had a son named Peter and a daughter named Katherine. In the fall of 1939, World War II begins. Oppenheimer, who was Jewish, had been an anti-Nazi ideology for some time. Organizations had emerged in America to help German Jews who tried to flee the country due to the anti-Semitic laws maintained by the Nazis led by Adolf Hitler. For the first time in his life, Oppenheimer became involved in politics since the mid-1930s, when he began to set aside 3% of his salary for the cause. After the Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. But initially, the United States provided military aid to Britain but did not intervene directly. The power of the occupier was highlighted as many other states joined the Nazis, such as Italy, Hungary, and Romania. An ultranationalist state, Imperial Japan joins the war in hopes of asserting its power over Britain's colonies outside of Europe. Deciding to preemptively attack the United States without declaring war, Japan bombarded Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and other American territories on December 7, 1941. It was this attack that plunged the United States into World War II. Nazi Germany, which was stronger by now, was trying to acquire a weapon of mass destruction to win the war quickly. By this time, a team led by Otto Robert Frisch and Liz had discovered nuclear fission, and the Nazis had started experiments to develop a nuclear weapon. Hungarian nuclear physicists Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein sent a letter warning the US government about this in August 1939. Due to this Japanese attack that happened 2 years later, the American authorities paid special attention to the need to hurry before the Nazis. A special group of people met on Manhattan Island and held preliminary discussions about this. This research and development program started by the United States government in 1942 with the aim of developing a nuclear bomb is called the Manhattan Project. Major General Leslie Groves oversaw the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer is chosen to lead a team of theoretical physicists and scientists involved in the project to develop a nuclear bomb. He is selected for this post after an interview. In the early winter of 1942, Oppenheimer was looking for a suitable location to establish a research station. It is decided to establish the headquarters of the project in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Robert Oppenheimer was in charge of the laboratory. The team Oppenheimer assembled at Los Alamos included some of the greatest scientists. In addition, many other engineers, metallurgists, chemists, and military experts joined the research groups at Los Alamos and worked extensively on the development of the first atomic weapon. When they gathered at Los Alamos, they had no idea what a nuclear explosion looked like and what its devastation might be, except for the theoretical knowledge of how a nuclear chain reaction could be produced. It is said that more than 5,000 people worked in various fields during the last period of the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. Although there were many rules at Los Alamos for security reasons, Oppenheimer was given the freedom and facilities he needed to carry out his work.
The spirit as well. It has extended the range of questions in which man has a choice. It has extended man's freedom to make
Oppenheimer, normally a thin man, became even thinner by working incredibly hard. Being a chain smoker, he often looked like a man in a smoke. The successful results of the research activities were visible. At the dawn of 1945, 2 nuclear bombs named Fat Man and Little Boy were created at Los Alamos. I have presented a separate video last week with a simple explanation of these 2 bombs and a nuclear explosion. I have explained the working of a nuclear bomb in a simple way. You can watch it from the above link. The team prepared to conduct the first nuclear test called Trinity. The Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico was chosen for this. The name means Dead Man's Way in Spanish. The date is July 16, 1945. There was only one building at the proposed blast site. It was the house where MacDonald, a German immigrant, lived in 1913. In 1942, the U.S. government acquired the area under the Manhattan Project, and it was abandoned. At a distance of about 9 kilometers from the place where the bomb was detonated, observation camps were established at 3 places: north, south, and west. Special goggles were provided to block harmful ultraviolet waves. Oppenheimer was under severe stress. At 5:29 a.m. Trinity explodes, releasing an explosive energy equal to 25,000 tons of TNT. This created a crater a third of a kilometer wide and melted sand across the launch site, turning it into a pale green glassy rock. After the explosion, they saw a ball of fire that turned purple, green, and orange to white. It then turned into a mushroom cloud and eventually spiraled 12 kilometers into the sky. The shock of the explosion was felt nearly 100 kilometers away, and those at the observation posts 9 kilometers away felt as if they were standing in front of an open oven for a few seconds. At this time, Oppenheimer is said to have quoted a statement from the Hindu god Vishnu in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the holy books of Hinduism, saying, "I have become death." This infamous statement was repeated in the media. In fact, he said that a certain statement from the Bhagavad Gita ran through his head. In fact, he remembered that if the brightness of 1,000 suns burst into the sky at once, it would look like this, is the part. However, it is true that Oppenheimer was happy at the moment. The dire consequences of Trinity's success were to follow within weeks. In the spring of 1945, the Allies invaded Germany from the east and west. At the end of April, Hitler committed suicide in Berlin and the Nazis surrendered, so the conflict in Europe was over. However, even then, the Japanese Empire did not want to surrender, and the Allies were focused on ending the war in the Pacific Ocean. On the other hand, it should not be forgotten that America had a strong need to respond to Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor. The US government calculated that this would result in millions of deaths as the Japanese would fight to the bitter end. After the death of President Roosevelt in the middle of April 1945, President Harry Truman was appointed as the president. It was decided to drop the little boy bomb on Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945. At Los Alamos that evening, Oppenheimer's face looked as triumphant as it did regret. "Sinful, helpless little people," came out of his mouth. About 1 lakh lives are killed in a few moments. This mood was quickly soured 3 days later when the United States dropped a second Fat Man bomb on Nagasaki, Japan. Dropping the first bomb on Hiroshima can be thought of as somewhat justified. But certainly, the Nagasaki bomb did not give the Japanese enough time to even decide to surrender in response to the first bomb. Japan surrenders 6 days after the Nagasaki bombing. With that, the war ends. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the only time in world history that nuclear weapons were used in warfare. Due to the intense heat that came out, people, animals, plants, buildings, etc. all got burnt in an instant. Both bombs killed approximately 2 million people simultaneously. Most of them are civilians. After that, for many months, people were dying in large numbers from burns, radiation and injuries, other diseases and malnutrition. On the one hand, the development of nuclear weapons has introduced a threat to the existence of modern mankind. But on the other hand, nuclear deterrence should also ensure that the world's superpowers and great powers have avoided major wars since 1945. With the end of the war, Oppenheimer's fame reached an unprecedented height. Accordingly, new opportunities opened up for him, and he decided to move to the East Coast in 1947 to take up a position as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a respected center for the study of physics. After the war, the Atomic Energy Commission was established to foster world peace, with Oppenheimer as its first chairman. Through it, he tried to discourage the development of a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it is correct to say that these efforts were futile. In 1949, the Soviets conducted their first nuclear weapons test. With news of the Soviet Union's acquisition of a nuclear weapon in the United States, President Harry Truman's government focused on developing a more powerful nuclear weapon than the atomic bomb, a hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb. Oppenheimer and many other scientists who contributed to the work at the Los Alamos Laboratory between 1942 and 1945 opposed such a move. But 3 years later, in November 1952, the first hydrogen bomb was tested in the Pacific Ocean. Named Ivy Mike, the bomb produced an explosion equivalent to 10 million tons of TNT, 450 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped by the United States on Japan. Oppenheimer watched all this in shock. Oppenheimer's less political connections with socialist and left-wing political movements and civil liberties organizations in America gradually developed, eventually leading to a special interest in political affairs. During this time, the Red Scare was spreading throughout America. However, Oppenheimer never joined the Communist Party of the United States. But many of his closest associates were active members of the Communist Party. Jean Tatlock, with whom he had been romantically involved since 1936, his wife Kitty and his brother Frank A. Many of his most prominent students at Berkeley also became official members of the party. Because of this, the authorities began to look at Oppenheimer with suspicion. Meanwhile, the FBI opened a file on him. The FBI misinterprets Oppenheimer as a Soviet asset operating in the United States. The US government revoked the special security powers it had been granted, as well as he is being forced to resign from government positions. Oppenheimer was facing difficult times. He spent much of his time away from society, even avoiding public involvement in the various campaigns and programs launched by people like Einstein to warn the government and American society about the dangers of excessive nuclear proliferation. Oppenheimer moved to the U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean and purchased an estate on St. John's Island, then known as Gibney Beach. This is now known as Oppenheimer Beach. In 1957, the French government awarded him the Legion d'Honneur in recognition of his services to the Allied cause. In 1962, he was made a foreign member of the Royal Society of Britain. In 1963, President John F. Although Kennedy gave Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award, many American political leaders looked at him with suspicion. 2 years later, in late 1965, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, no doubt caused by his lifetime of smoking. He fell into a coma in early 1967 and died at home in Princeton on February 18. Although many political leaders viewed him with skepticism, the academic community's respect for Oppenheimer was evident at the funeral. In addition, over 600 military colleagues participated, many of whom had worked with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. His ashes were later buried in the waters off St. John's Island in the Caribbean Sea. Oppenheimer was ultimately confused about what he had discovered and released to society. Because he clearly knew that one day, if man resorted to using nuclear weapons for war, it would cause the destruction of the entire world. Oppenheimer left, opening a huge door to the destruction of not only mankind, but the entire world. Life in this world will last only as long as man decides to step through it.